The fire call came in at 11:49 p.m. The officer who spotted the smoke from his patrol car didn't think much of it at first. A commercial strip in North Austin. Friday night. Could have been anything. He radioed it in and pulled toward the building on West Anderson Lane, an ice cream and yogurt shop that had been open for less than 2 years. The kind of place teenagers worked weekend shifts and parents brought kids after soccer practice. The Austin Fire Department arrived within minutes. They pushed through the front entrance expecting a grease fire. A faulty wire. The usual. They found something they were not prepared for. I want to pause here for a second. If this case is new to you, drop a comment below and let me know. And if you've heard of it before, tell me what you already knew, because what most people think they know about this case is only part of the story. A small part. The part that gets repeated. The part that got it wrong. Because here is the thing about the yogurt shop case. It wasn't solved when they arrested someone. It wasn't solved when someone confessed. It wasn't solved when a jury came back with a verdict. It was solved, really solved, 34 years later, by evidence that had been sitting in a box. Evidence that pointed to a man who had been dead for over 2 decades. And the reason that evidence existed at all came down to one girl, 13 years old. In the last moments of her life, she did something most people never would have thought to do. She fought back. Hard enough to leave a mark. Hard enough to leave DNA. But to understand what that means, what it actually cost, and what it finally answered, you have to go back to the night it started. A Friday in December. The last shift 4 girls would ever work. December 6th, 1991 was cold by Austin standards. Not the kind of cold that stops a city. Temperatures in the low 40s, a dry wind off the hill country that made the parking lots feel emptier than they were. The kind of night where the drive-through lines thin out early and the last hour of a retail shift feels like it goes on forever. Jennifer Harbison was 17. She was a senior at Anderson High School, the kind of student who showed up early and stayed late, who had already put in enough hours at the yogurt shop on West Anderson Lane to know the closing routine by memory. Wipe the machines. Count the drawer. Stack the chairs. She was practical in the way that teenagers who work real jobs tend to become: steady, reliable, the kind of coworker you wanted on a closing shift. Her sister Sarah was 15, a freshman, where Jennifer moved through a room with the quiet confidence of someone who knew what she was doing. Sarah was still figuring out who she was, trying out the school volleyball team, showing up for freshman events, still at that age where the weekend feels wide open. She had come to the shop that night to catch a ride home with her sister when the store closed at 11. Eliza Thomas was also 17. She and Jennifer worked the closing shift together regularly. Eliza was the kind of person who filled a room. Her younger sister Sonora would later describe her as someone who laughed at everything, who had opinions about music and fashion and could talk to anyone. She was saving up for something, the way teenagers do when they first realize money means options. Amy Ayers was 13. She was the youngest by 4 years and had come to know the older girls through the Future Farmers of America program at school, an organization that would surprise anyone who pictured a 13-year-old from suburban Austin. Amy was a country kid at heart. Her father would later say she was a daddy's girl, that she wanted to be a veterinarian, that she already had the kind of patience with animals that most adults never develop. The 4 of them were in the shop together that Friday night. Jennifer and Eliza working, Sarah and Amy waiting for the ride home. None of them made it out. By the time the fire was noticed, by the time that patrol officer glanced toward the smoke and reached for his radio, whatever had happened inside was already over. The firefighters who entered the store that night were not crime scene investigators. They were there to put out a fire, and they did. But the water from the hoses, the damage from the flames, the disruption of a working fire suppression system already running, all of it hit the same space at the same time. Evidence that might have lasted for decades was destroyed in under an hour. When the smoke cleared enough to see, first responders found 4 bodies in the back of the store. All 4 girls were unclothed. All 4 had been bound. Jennifer, Sarah, and Eliza had been gagged with their own clothing, their wrists and ankles tied. 3 of them had been stacked together in the storage area near the back wall, badly burned from a fire that investigators would later determine had been set deliberately, using accelerant, specifically to destroy what was inside. Amy was found separately, near the bathroom. She had burns covering 25 to 30% of her body, severe, but less than the others. She had a sock-like cloth pulled around her neck. She had 2 gunshot wounds. The first had missed critical structures, which meant she had been conscious or had moved when the trigger was pulled. The second shot was the one that killed her. She had also been sexually assaulted. And beneath the fingernails of her right hand, scraped there in whatever final seconds she had, was a trace of biological material that didn't belong to her. At the time, the technology to extract a usable DNA profile from that sample did not exist. The evidence was collected by Detective John Jones and his crime scene unit, bagged and labeled, and entered into the evidence chain. It was noted, it was stored, and it would sit untouched for the next 3 decades. The medical examiner confirmed what the scene already indicated. All 4 girls had been shot in the head, execution style, with a .22 caliber bullet. The fire had been set after, which told investigators the person responsible had planned for this, not panicked and fled, but stayed long enough to try to erase what they had done. One detail from the scene would surface years later during a re-examination of the evidence. A single shell casing had been found lodged in a floor drain, protected from the water and fire by the metal casing around it, partially intact. At the time, it was collected and stored with the rest of the physical evidence. Nobody processed it against a ballistics database in 1991. There was no national database to run it against. The technology didn't exist yet. In the weeks after the murders, a witness account placed 2 men inside the shop in the hour before closing. A couple who had stopped in for yogurt that evening described seeing 2 men sitting at a table near the front. One of them had asked to use the restroom in the back, a request the girls had allowed. The couple noticed the men seemed to be watching the store more than eating. When the couple left, the men were still there. Those 2 men were never definitively identified. Investigators also noted that the rear door of the shop showed signs of having been propped open, a method that would have allowed someone to wait, to watch the closing routine play out, to know exactly when the last customer left. The Austin Police Department opened a full homicide investigation. The tip line was announced publicly within 24 hours. What came next would shape the case for the next 20 years, and not in the direction anyone expected. The tips kept coming. So did the confessions. Over the following years, not weeks, not months, but years, more than 50 people confessed to the yogurt shop murders. 50. Some walked into police stations voluntarily. Some surfaced in jails and prisons while doing time for unrelated crimes. Some came forward through attorneys. Investigators worked through each one, cross-referencing details that had never been released to the public, looking for the person who knew something only someone present that night could know. None of the 50 confessions held up. The investigation developed a theory. The specificity of the crime, the binding, the execution, the deliberate fire, suggested someone with a particular kind of experience. Detectives looked at whether the killings bore the signature of a traveling offender, someone who moved through cities and didn't stay long enough to be found. A profile was developed. Tips were run against it. The investigation was moving. It looked like it was moving, but it was moving in circles. Then, in 1999, the case took a direction that would consume the next several years and ultimately destroy the lives of people who had nothing to do with the murders. A detective who had recently been assigned to the case pulled out the early suspect files, the 4 teenagers eliminated in the first weeks of the investigation. In the years since 1991, those 4 boys had grown into men. The detective had a theory that the early elimination had been premature, that the interrogators in 1991 had given up too quickly. The 4 men were located and brought back in for questioning. Their names were Robert Springsteen, Maurice Pierce, Michael Scott, and Forrest Wellborn. They were in their mid-20s now. The interrogations were long. They were unrecorded in full. And by the time they were over, investigators had obtained confessions from 2 of the 4, Springsteen and Scott. The confessions contained details about the crime scene. Investigators pointed to this as proof of their reliability. Defense attorneys pointed out that some of those details had been mentioned in news coverage over the years, and that the interrogation sessions had lasted for hours without legal counsel present during critical portions. Both men said they had been coerced. Both men said the confessions were not true. Neither confession was supported by physical evidence connecting the men to the scene. No DNA, no fingerprints, no forensic link of any kind. If you are watching this right now, pause for 1 second. Think about what it means to confess to something you didn't do. Most people say they never would. Research into false confessions suggests it is far more common than that, particularly under extended interrogation, sleep deprivation, and the specific psychological pressure of being told that cooperation is the only path out of a room. It happens. It happened here. In 2001, Springsteen and Scott were tried separately. The prosecution's case rested almost entirely on the confessions. Because the two men had agreed not to testify against each other, prosecutors read portions of each man's confession to the opposing jury, a legal mechanism that the defense teams argued was a fundamental violation of the right to confrontation. Robert Springsteen was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Michael Scott was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The jury in Springsteen's case had been told, in open court, that the DNA recovered from one of the victims did not match Springsteen. The jury convicted anyway. The jury knew the DNA didn't match, and they convicted anyway. That detail does not get smaller the more you look at it. Robert Springsteen sat on death row for 6 years. In 2006, a federal appeals court overturned his conviction, not on the question of innocence, but on the constitutional violation of using Scott's confession against him without allowing cross-examination. He was granted a new trial. Before that retrial could proceed, the charges were dropped. Springsteen walked out. Michael Scott's conviction was also overturned on similar grounds. The charges against him were dropped in 2009. Maurice Pierce and Forrest Wellborn had never been convicted. Pierce had been charged, and the case was dismissed before trial for lack of evidence. Wellborn had never been formally charged. All 4 men were out. None had been formally declared innocent. There is a distance, a significant, documented distance, between charges being dropped and innocence being established. In Texas, formal exoneration requires a specific legal process. That process was not completed for these men, which meant that for years after their release, they carried the weight of a case that had publicly attached their names to 4 murders. Bob Ayers, Amy's father, had spent those years watching the legal proceedings from the outside. He had buried his 13-year-old daughter in December of 1991. He had watched confessions, trials, verdicts, and appeals move through a system that kept promising resolution and delivering something else. Every development in the case required him to return to it, to be asked by journalists and investigators and courthouse cameras whether he believed justice had been served. He did not sleep well in those years. He had said so publicly, not in the dramatic language of someone performing grief, but in the flat, tired way of someone who had just learned that grief doesn't have a finish line. Barbara Ayers Wilson, who had raised Jennifer and Sarah, had watched her only 2 children be taken in a single night. At Christmas that year, and for years after, her daughter's places at the table existed in her awareness in a way that had no language. She kept photographs. She kept answering questions when journalists called. Sonora Thomas had been 13 years old when her older sister Eliza was killed. She and Eliza had shared a bedroom. She would later describe the weeks after the murder as a kind of walking unreality, the persistent, irrational belief that her sister had somehow survived, had run somewhere, was going to come back. That feeling didn't resolve cleanly. It evolved into something harder and quieter. Sonora grew up. She kept her sister's name in her mouth. She kept saying it in interviews when the case resurfaced, which it did periodically over the years, always with a new development that didn't quite hold. The case didn't just take lives that night. It kept taking them for years after. By the early 2010s, the yogurt shop case had been open for over 20 years. The 2 convictions had collapsed. The confessions that built them had been discredited. The original physical evidence, compromised by fire and water on the night of the crime, had never produced a workable forensic lead. The tip line still existed, technically. Nobody was actively staffing it. The Austin Police Department had not closed the case. Officially, it remained open. But in practical terms, the investigation had stalled so completely that the families had stopped expecting news. They had developed a specific, practiced way of living with the not knowing, functional, present in their daily lives, and permanently altered in a way that didn't show unless you knew to look. New detectives would occasionally be assigned to review the file. They would read through thousands of pages of reports, follow up on a handful of leads, and arrive at the same wall the previous investigators had hit. The confession-based theory had collapsed. The physical evidence was degraded. The witnesses who might once have offered something useful had scattered across decades. And then there was the DNA. Still in storage. Still attached to the case file. Still waiting for technology to catch up with what it was. What the detectives in those years did not know, could not have known from inside the case file alone, was that the man responsible for the murders had already crossed paths with law enforcement twice. Once while the investigation was still in its first week, and once in a separate state, in a separate crime, under a separate case number that no one had ever thought to connect to Austin. The worst part? The real answer had already slipped past them, years earlier, and the name they would eventually find, the one that would finally close this, was nowhere in the original case files. Not a single page. Detective Dan Jackson was assigned to the yogurt shop case in 2015. He was not the first detective to inherit it. He would not be the last, or so it seemed likely at the time. Jackson sent the original biological evidence for reanalysis. The vaginal swabs collected during the autopsies of 3 of the victims were submitted to a forensic laboratory for updated DNA processing. The analysts used a method called YSTR testing, a technique that targets the male Y chromosome specifically, allowing investigators to isolate a male DNA profile even in a mixed or degraded sample. It takes time. It requires patience and precision. It is not the kind of process that produces results in a week. When the results came back, they contained a YSTR profile. Male. Consistent across multiple samples from multiple victims. A single contributor. That profile did not match Robert Springsteen. It did not match Michael Scott. It did not match Maurice Pierce or Forrest Wellborn. It did not match any of the 50-plus individuals who had confessed over the years. It matched no one in the national DNA database at the time. The evidence didn't change. The ability to understand it did. Jackson and his team continued. The shell casing recovered from the drain, the one protected from the fire by the metal surround, collected on the night of the crime, stored for decades, was submitted for ballistics analysis against an updated national firearms database. Investigators were looking for a pattern match, not a serial number, not a registration. A pattern, the specific microscopic marks left on a bullet casing by the individual mechanics of a particular firearm. And then Jackson's team did something that had not been done systematically before on this case. They looked outside Austin. They looked at crimes in other states. Crimes with similar methods, similar victim profiles, similar evidence signatures. The investigation crossed into South Carolina. In 1990, a year before the yogurt shop murders, a young woman had been sexually assaulted and killed in a case that remained unsolved. DNA had been collected at that scene. A profile had been developed and entered into a database. When investigators ran a cross-comparison between the South Carolina profile and the YSTR profile developed from the Austin victims, the results came back consistent. Same contributor, different state, different year. Take a second right now, because this is the moment the entire case shifted direction. If this story has you locked in, subscribe and turn on notifications. The next part is the one nobody expected. And if someone in your life needs to hear this story, share it right now before we go any further. The name attached to the South Carolina profile was Robert Eugene Brashers. Brashers had never appeared in the Austin case file. Not once. Not as a tip. Not as a suspect. Not as a name mentioned in passing. He was not from Austin. He had no known connection to the yogurt shop, to the victims, or to anyone in their lives. What he did have was a documented history of violent sexual offenses across multiple states. He had been arrested, charged, released. He had moved. He had crossed state lines. He had continued. On December 8, 1991, 48 hours after the yogurt shop murders, Brasher's had been stopped at a Border Patrol checkpoint between El Paso, Texas, and Las Cruces, New Mexico. He was driving a stolen vehicle from Georgia. He was in possession of a .380 caliber pistol. Border Patrol noted the stop. They flagged the stolen vehicle. They did not connect him to Austin, because in December of 1991, no system existed to make that connection automatically. He was processed and released. He crossed into New Mexico and kept driving. The name they found was not in any of the original case files. But what Jackson's team discovered next about what happened to Brasher's after 1991 was the detail that changed the nature of the entire investigation. Robert Eugene Brasher's died in June of 1999. He did not die in prison. He did not die from illness. He died in a standoff with police in Missouri after being pulled over for driving another stolen vehicle. He raised a weapon. Officers responded. He fired his weapon at himself before they could reach him. He was 50 years old. The weapon he used to end his own life was a .380 caliber pistol. The same make, the same model, the same serial number as the gun confiscated at the El Paso checkpoint in December of 1991, 2 days after 4 teenage girls were murdered in Austin, Texas. Investigators confirmed the serial number match. The gun Brasher's carried out of Texas in December of 1991 was the same gun he died with in Missouri 8 years later. And when that weapon was submitted for ballistics comparison against the shell casing recovered from the yogurt shop drain, the one that had sat in evidence storage for 34 years, the patterns were consistent. The Austin Police Department announced the breakthrough publicly on September 26, 2025. Detective Jackson stood at a podium in front of cameras and reporters and families who had been waiting since 1991, and he said the name out loud. Robert Eugene Brasher's. He laid out the evidence methodically, the DNA, the ballistics, the geographic timeline, the Border Patrol record from December 8th. He described the genetic genealogy work done by forensics specialist C.C. Moore, who had constructed a family tree from the DNA profile and narrowed the field to Brasher's as the source. Then Jackson said something that the families in that room had needed to hear for a very long time. He said that it was Amy who had solved the case. Not the system. Not a confession. Not a tip from a caller who had seen something. A 13-year-old girl, in the last moments of her life, had scratched her attacker hard enough to leave skin under her fingernails. That skin survived the fire. It survived 34 years of storage. It survived long enough for technology to extract a profile, for investigators to cross-reference it against a separate crime in a separate state, and for the chain of evidence to finally close around a name. While Springsteen and Scott had been convicted and imprisoned, while Pierce and Wellborn had lived for years with their names attached to 4 murders, Brasher's had been dead since 1999. He had never been charged. He had never sat in a courtroom. He had stopped by a checkpoint 2 days after the crime, been released, and driven away. The case was solved, but not in a way anyone expected. And the question that the families, the wrongly convicted men, and the city of Austin were left to sit with was one that the announcement did not answer and could not answer. How many times had the system had him and let him go? In the months after the September 2025 announcement, the legal and institutional process moved to address what the investigation had confirmed. Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott had already been released years earlier when their convictions were overturned. But formal declarations of innocence, the specific legal designation under Texas law, had not been issued. The announcement that Brasher's had been identified as the actual perpetrator renewed and accelerated those proceedings. Under Texas law, a person formally declared innocent after wrongful imprisonment may receive up to $80,000 for each year they were incarcerated. Springsteen had spent 6 years on death row. Scott had spent years in prison. The math of what had been taken from them was not complicated. The process of formally acknowledging it was slower than it should have been. The families of Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy were not silent during this period. They did not retreat from cameras or refuse to speak. They showed up. Barbara Ayers Wilson, who had raised Jennifer and Sarah, who had set their places at the table long after anyone expected her to, spoke publicly about what the announcement meant. She said it meant her daughters had not been forgotten. She said it meant the people who had worked the case for decades had not given up. She said these things carefully, precisely, the way a person speaks when they have thought about a moment for 34 years and want to get it right. Bob Ayers, Amy's father, had waited longer than most fathers should ever have to wait. He had watched the wrong men go to trial. He had watched those convictions fall apart. He had watched the years accumulate without an answer. When the announcement came, he did not describe it as relief. Relief implies the burden is gone. What he described was closer to something settling, a weight not lifted, but finally understood. Sonora Thomas had been 13 years old when her sister Eliza was killed. She had grown up carrying that age with her, the age she was when everything changed, the age her sister had nearly been. When she spoke after the announcement, she said Eliza's name the way she always had, clearly, without hesitation, as though the years had not worn it down. This case revealed something specific about the way investigations fail, not through bad intentions alone, but through structural gaps. In 1991, no national forensic database existed that could have connected Brasher's DNA from South Carolina to Austin. No ballistics system existed that could have matched the shell casing to his weapon automatically. No cross-state alert would have flagged the Border Patrol stop at El Paso as relevant to an open homicide in Travis County. The gaps were not invented by anyone. They were real. They were the product of a time when the tools did not exist. But the false confessions, the interrogations that lasted for hours without adequate legal protection, the convictions built on statements that contained no physical corroboration, those were not gaps in technology. Those were decisions made by people inside a system that was under pressure to produce an answer. And the cost of those decisions was measured in years. In 2 men's freedom. In the families of 4 girls spending additional decades without a true resolution, because the investigation had invested so heavily in the wrong direction that it took that much longer to look in the right one. The evidence didn't fail. The process around the evidence did. Amy Lee Ayers was 13 years old. She had come to the yogurt shop that night to catch a ride home with her friend and her friend's older sister. She wanted to be a veterinarian. She was 13. And somehow, because of her, the truth survived long enough to be found. Jennifer Harbison was 17. Sarah Harbison was 15. Eliza Thomas was 17. Amy Ayers was 13. Their names belong in the record, not as case numbers, not as evidence markers, as people who were there on an ordinary Friday night, who had plans, who had people waiting for them at home, and who never made it back. Cases like this one do not end when the DNA matches. They end when enough people know the names of the people who were lost. Share this video. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story on this channel. And in the comments, tell us what this case made you feel. Every name said out loud is a refusal to let the record close too quietly. Justice delayed is still justice, but only if we refuse to stop talking about it.